Who authorized this detention? The voice cracked through the radio like something breaking beneath the surface, sharp enough to make even the night air feel heavier. But Officer Daniel Hayes didn't answer. Not yet. His grip still firm on the wrist of the woman standing beside his patrol car, her posture steady despite the tension curling through the scene, red and blue lights washing over her dark skin and pulses, turning the quiet street into a stage where judgment came fast and truth came slow. And to him, she was just another suspect, just another name to check, another story that didn't quite add up, a nurse out too late, too calm, too composed for someone being questioned. "You fit the description," he said, voice edged with certainty he hadn't earned. But she didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't plead. She simply met his eyes with a stillness that didn't belong in moments like this. The kind of stillness that makes people uncomfortable because it feels like control, like she knew something he didn't, like she was waiting. And maybe that was what unsettled him most. The way her breathing stayed even, the way her shoulders didn't tense, the way her gaze didn't drop. Because people in her position usually reacted, they explained, they defended, they tried to prove they belonged. But she didn't. She just stood there, silent, present, watching, as if she had already seen how this would play out. And around them the world kept moving, cars passing by, a few pedestrians slowing down just enough to glance over, phones subtly raised, capturing fragments of a moment they didn't fully understand, a quiet judgment forming without context. Because that's how it always starts, isn't it? With assumptions, with surface-level truths that feel complete until they're not. Hayes adjusted his stance, his confidence still intact. But something in the air had shifted, something small, almost invisible, like a thread being pulled too tight. And then the radio crackled again, louder this time. More urgent. Unit 12, confirm identity. Repeat, confirm identity of the individual you've detained. And for the first time his attention flickered, just a fraction, just enough to break the rhythm of control he thought he had. And she noticed. Of course she did, because her eyes followed everything, every movement, every hesitation, every crack in the armor he didn't realize he was wearing. And still she said nothing. Not yet. Not when the silence itself was doing all the work, stretching between them, heavy, deliberate, waiting for the moment when the truth would no longer need permission to be heard. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, like the night itself was holding its breath. And then the radio came alive again, sharper now, no longer a routine check, but a demand. Unit 12, respond immediately, confirm the identity. And this time there was something underneath the words, something that did not belong to ordinary dispatch traffic, something that carried weight. And Officer Hayes felt it. Even if he could not yet name it, his jaw tightening slightly as he reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. But before he could speak, the woman shifted, not pulling away, not resisting, just adjusting her stance as if the ground beneath her belonged to her more than to him. And that subtle movement did more than any argument could have done. It unsettled the rhythm he had been following. Because control is easy when the other person reacts, when they fill the space with fear or frustration. But she did neither. She remained quiet, composed, her eyes scanning the scene not with panic but with awareness, as if she was cataloging every detail, every face, every sound, the distant hum of traffic, the faint buzz of streetlights, the soft murmur of onlookers who had begun to gather at the edges of the moment, drawn in by curiosity they did not fully understand. And somewhere in that growing crowd a phone lifted higher, capturing everything. The flashing lights, the uniform, the stillness of the woman who did not match the story being built around her. Hayes finally pressed the button on his radio, his voice steady but clipped. "This is Unit 12, routine stop, possible theft investigation." The words sounded smaller than he intended, almost rehearsed, and for a brief second he wondered why. On the other end there was a pause, not static, not interference, just silence, the kind that signals someone important is listening. And then a different voice came through, deeper, controlled, described the individual. Hayes glanced at her again, taking in the simple navy scrubs, the hospital badge clipped neatly at her chest, the lack of anything that should have raised suspicion beyond the assumptions already made. Female, approximately 5'7", African-American, claims to be a nurse, he said, each word sounding more certain than he felt. And as soon as he finished, the silence returned, heavier this time, stretching longer, pressing in from all sides, until it broke with a single sentence that shifted everything without raising its volume. Stay where you are. The tone was not a suggestion. It was not a question. It was instruction. And for the first time since the moment began, Hayes felt the ground beneath his confidence shift, just slightly, just enough to notice, just enough to wonder why a simple stop had suddenly become something else entirely. And beside him, the woman finally moved her gaze from his face to the street ahead, where distant headlights were beginning to appear, slow, deliberate, approaching with a purpose that did not need to be announced. And still she said nothing, because she did not need to, not anymore. The headlights did not rush forward. They approached slowly, deliberately, cutting through the darkness like a decision already made. And in that moment, something invisible shifted in the air, something that did not need to be explained but could be felt, the kind of shift that makes people straighten their posture without knowing why. Officer Hayes noticed it in the way the murmurs from the small crowd began to fade, in the way a second patrol unit down the block suddenly went quiet on the radio, in the way his own grip loosened just a fraction without him consciously deciding to let go. And beside him the woman remained exactly the same, calm, composed, her breathing steady, her gaze now fixed on the approaching vehicles as if she had been expecting them all along, not hoping, not guessing, expecting, and that realization landed heavier than anything the radio had said, because expectation meant certainty, and certainty meant this moment had never truly belonged to him in the first place. The lead vehicle slowed to a stop about 20 feet away, engine idling, headlights still on, not flashing, not aggressive, just present. And then the doors opened in sequence, not rushed, not chaotic, but controlled, measured, as if every step had been rehearsed. Figures stepped out, dressed differently from the usual street patrol, their posture alone carrying a kind of authority that did not rely on raised voices or visible rank. And for the first time, Hayes felt the edges of his certainty begin to blur, not collapse, not yet, but soften, like a story that no longer fits the facts in front of it. One of the men approached, his expression neutral, eyes scanning the scene quickly, taking in the patrol car, the gathered crowd, the woman, and finally Hayes himself. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost quiet, but it carried in a way that made people listen without being told to. "Officer, I need you to explain the situation." There was no accusation in the tone, but there was no room for improvisation either. Hayes straightened slightly, instinctively, his training guiding him back into structure. "Routine stop, possible theft report," he repeated, but this time the words felt thinner, like they were being weighed as soon as they left his mouth. The man's gaze shifted to the woman, just for a moment, and in that brief exchange something passed between them. Not a signal anyone else could read, but enough to confirm what had already been set in motion. Then the man nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before looking back at Hayes. "And you confirmed her identity?" he asked. Simple question, direct, and suddenly that question felt larger than it should have, because Hayes realized he had not fully, not beyond the surface, not beyond what he assumed to be true, and assumptions, in moments like this, begin to sound like mistakes. He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough, the silence answering before he could, and behind him the radio remained quiet now. No static, no follow-up, just absence, as if the next part of the conversation no longer belonged to that channel. And the woman finally spoke, her voice calm, even, not raised, not defensive, just present. "Officer, you asked me who I was," she said, her eyes still steady. "But you never waited for the answer." And for the first time since the moment began, Hayes understood that this was not the beginning of something. It was the end of it. He just had not realized it until now. The words did not echo, but they lingered, settling into the space between them like something undeniable. And for a moment no one moved. Not the officers who had just arrived, not the small crowd that had grown quiet without realizing it. Not even Officer Hayes, who now stood in a silence that felt very different from the one he had controlled earlier, because this one was not his. This one was waiting for something else, something final. The man who had stepped forward shifted his stance. Slightly, his attention no longer divided, fully focused now. And when he spoke again, his tone carried a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "Ma'am, please confirm your name for the record." It was not a question asked out of doubt. It was a formality, a step in a process that had already moved beyond uncertainty. And the woman answered without hesitation, her voice steady, grounded. "Amara Brooks." Just 2 words, simple, but the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like a key fitting into a lock that had been waiting to turn. The man nodded once, then reached into his jacket and produced a small identification wallet, flipping it open just enough for Hayes to see. Though the details were not spoken out loud, they did not need to be. The reaction alone said everything. The slight shift in posture, the tightening of the jaw, the sudden awareness that the situation had already moved beyond his control several minutes ago, and he had simply been the last to realize it. The night air felt different now, cooler somehow, sharper, as if the truth had cut through whatever fog had been guiding the moment before. The man closed the identification and spoke again, still calm, still measured. "Colonel Brooks is under federal protection and active assignment." Each word placed carefully, not to intimidate, but to establish reality. And reality, in moments like this, does not need to raise its voice. It simply exists, unmovable. Hayes felt the weight of that reality settle in, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a structure quietly collapsing from within, his earlier certainty now replaced with something heavier, something closer to recognition, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding, it was about what had been assumed before any facts were confirmed. And assumptions, once exposed, have a way of revealing more than the situation itself. Around them the crowd had gone still, phones still raised but no longer moving, capturing not action, but consequence. And Amara remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, composed, steady, her hands still, her expression unchanged, because nothing about this moment surprised her. Not the misunderstanding, not the escalation, not even the arrival of authority. She had seen it all unfold before it happened, and now she simply stood at the center of it, not as a victim, not as a suspect, but as something else entirely, something that did not need to announce itself to be understood. The man turned slightly toward Hayes, his tone unchanged but final now. "Officer, you will release her immediately." And there it was, not a suggestion, not a negotiation, just a statement of what was going to happen next. And for the first time since the encounter began, Hayes hesitated in a way that could not be hidden, not because he did not understand the instruction, but because he finally did, completely. For a brief second, everything slowed, not the world itself, but the way it was perceived, like a moment stretching just long enough for truth to settle in. And Officer Hayes felt it, that quiet shift where denial no longer had space to exist, his hands still, his thoughts catching up to what had already been made clear. The command had been given, simple, direct, irreversible, and yet it carried more than instruction. It carried consequence, the kind that does not announce itself loudly but arrives all the same. And as he reached forward, the motion was no longer driven by authority, but by realization, a realization that this moment would not be defined by what he had believed at the start, but by what he had failed to see. The cuffs came free with a soft metallic sound, not dramatic, not sharp, just final. And Amara did not react the way most would. There was no visible relief, no outward frustration, no attempt to reclaim control because she had never lost it. She simply adjusted her wrist slightly, as if removing something temporary, something that had never truly belonged there. Her posture unchanged, her expression steady, and that steadiness now carried a different weight. Not quiet endurance, but undeniable presence, the kind that fills a space without needing to raise its voice. Around them the air felt different, the tension that had once been thick with assumption now replaced by something heavier, accountability. Even the crowd seemed to sense it. Their whispers gone, their phones still raised but no longer capturing a spectacle, now capturing a shift, a reversal that had happened without force, without escalation, just with truth stepping into the room. The man who had arrived with the others watched closely, not with suspicion but with certainty, ensuring that the moment unfolded exactly as it should. And when Amara finally moved, it was not hurried, not reactive, just deliberate. One step forward, then another, reclaiming space that had never truly been taken from her. And for Hayes, standing there in the fading echo of his own authority, the realization settled deeper. This had never been about a routine stop, never been about a simple mistake. It had been about what he chose to see before he chose to understand. And that choice now stood exposed, not through confrontation, but through contrast, the contrast between assumption and reality, between control and composure, between speaking first and listening too late. Amara paused just long enough to glance back, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something quieter, something that carried more weight than either, recognition. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, unchanged, but now every word landed differently. Next time, ask before you decide, she said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a truth that did not need to be enforced. And then she turned forward again, stepping toward the waiting vehicles, toward the path that had always been hers, leaving behind a moment that would not be forgotten, not because of what had happened, but because of what it revealed. And in the stillness that followed, one thing became undeniable. Authority is not proven by force. It is revealed by how quickly it disappears when the truth arrives. The vehicles did not leave right away, their engines still running low and steady, like a quiet reminder that this moment was not over yet. And as Amara stepped closer, one of the men opened a rear door for her, not as a gesture of urgency, but of respect, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. She paused for just a second before getting in, her eyes scanning the scene one last time, not searching, not questioning, simply observing, as if committing every detail to memory. And then she stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her, sealing the moment without drama, without noise, just a quiet finality, the kind that leaves more impact than anything loud ever could. Outside, the man who had spoken earlier turned his attention fully back to Officer Hayes, and this time the silence between them felt different, not uncertain, not tense, but measured, as if what came next had already been decided long before this encounter began. "Officer Hayes," he said, his voice calm, but now carrying a weight that was unmistakable. "You will remain here." Not a command shouted across the street, not an order backed by force, but something more controlled, more precise, the kind of instruction that leaves no room for interpretation. Hayes nodded slightly, almost automatically, his earlier confidence now replaced with a stillness that felt heavier, more aware, because this was no longer about the situation in front of him. It was about everything that had led to it, every assumption, every decision made without pause, without verification, without question. And as the seconds passed, the surrounding environment seemed to shift again, the crowd slowly dispersing, their curiosity replaced by something quieter, something reflective, the flashing lights now less dramatic, more routine, as if the scene itself was returning to normal. But for Hayes, nothing felt routine anymore. The space around him seemed clearer, sharper, every sound more distinct, the faint hum of the patrol car, the distant echo of traffic, the soft murmur of radios in the background. And in that clarity came understanding, not forced, not immediate, but undeniable, the kind that settles in slowly and stays. The man stepped closer, just enough to lower his voice, not to hide his words, but to make sure they were heard exactly as intended. "This is not about a mistake," he said, each word deliberate. "This is about how quickly you decided who she was before you knew anything at all." And there it was, not an accusation, not anger, just truth, placed plainly between them. And Hayes did not respond, not because he could not, but because there was nothing to correct, nothing to defend. The moment had already spoken for itself, and somewhere down the street, the vehicles began to move, one by one, pulling away with the same controlled presence they had arrived with, taking with them the center of the story, leaving behind only what remained, the aftermath, the realization, the lesson that did not need to be repeated to be understood. And as the last set of headlights disappeared into the distance, one thing lingered in the quiet that followed, the understanding that authority is not defined by the power you hold in the moment, but by the judgment you choose before the moment even begins. The street felt emptier now, not because the people had all left, but because the energy that once filled it had shifted into something quieter, something harder to ignore, and Officer Hayes remained standing beside his patrol car, his hands resting at his sides, no longer gripping, no longer directing, just present in a moment that had already moved past him. The flashing lights continued to rotate, casting familiar patterns across the pavement, but even those lights seemed different now, less like symbols of authority and more like reminders of responsibility. And for the first time that night, Hayes did not look outward. He looked inward, replaying the sequence in his mind, not the ending, but the beginning, the moment he first saw her, the assumptions that formed before a single word was exchanged, the certainty he felt without evidence, and how easily that certainty had guided everything that followed. And as he stood there, the weight of that realization did not come with noise or confrontation. It came quietly, settling in peace. By peace, undeniable, unshakable. The other officer who had arrived earlier stepped closer now, his presence calm, not intrusive, just enough to be felt. And for a moment he said nothing, allowing the silence to do what it needed to do, before finally speaking in a tone that carried neither judgment nor comfort, just clarity. "Moments like this do not start when the lights turn on," he said, his eyes briefly scanning the now quiet street. "They start the second you decide what you are looking at." Hayes did not respond immediately, not because he disagreed, but because the truth of it left no room for quick answers, no easy way to shift the meaning of what had already happened. And as the seconds passed, the sound of a distant siren faded into the background, the city continuing on as it always did, indifferent to individual moments. But those moments still mattered, especially the ones that revealed something deeper than what was visible on the surface. Hayes finally exhaled slowly, his posture shifting slightly, not in defeat, but in awareness, a recognition that what had unfolded was not just an isolated event. It was a reflection, and reflections do not lie. They show what is there whether it is acknowledged or not. The other officer nodded once, as if confirming something unspoken, before stepping back, giving Hayes the space to stand with that understanding on his own. And in that space, something changed. Not dramatic, not immediate, but real, the kind of change that does not announce itself but begins quietly, shaping what comes next. And as Hayes reached up to adjust his radio, his movements were slower now, more deliberate, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because for the first time that night, he was no longer acting on assumption. He was aware of it, and that awareness carried a different kind of weight, one that could not be ignored once it had been seen. The streetlights hummed softly above, steady and unchanged, casting their glow across a scene that had returned to normal in appearance, but not in meaning, because some moments do not leave marks on the ground. They leave them on the people who stand in them. And as Hayes finally stepped back toward his patrol car, one thought remained, clear and unavoidable. Authority is not about being right in the moment. It is about being willing to question yourself before the moment decides for you. The engine of the patrol car hummed softly as Officer Hayes finally opened the driver's side door, but he did not get in right away, his hand resting on the frame as if he needed a moment to adjust to something that could not be seen, because the street had returned to its usual rhythm, passing cars, distant conversations, the ordinary movement of a city that does not pause for individual realizations. And yet for him, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every detail now carried a different weight. The way the light reflected off the pavement, the faint echo of footsteps fading into the distance. Even the silence itself felt more defined, as if it was no longer empty, but filled with everything that had just happened. And as he stood there, he replayed not just the moment of release, but the seconds before it, the exact point where he could have asked a different question, where he could have paused instead of deciding, where he could have listened instead of assuming. And that point, that single moment, now stood out clearer than anything else, because it was the moment that changed everything without making a sound. He finally slid into the driver's seat, the familiar interior now feeling slightly unfamiliar, not physically different, but altered by perspective, the dashboard lights steady, the radio quiet, waiting. And for the first time that night, he did not reach for it immediately. He simply sat there, hands resting lightly on the wheel, his mind moving slower now, more deliberate, as if each thought needed to be examined before it was accepted. Across the street, one last bystander lingered, lowering their phone after what must have been the final recording, their expression unreadable, not judgmental, not sympathetic, just aware, and that awareness seemed to mirror his own, because this was no longer about what others had seen, it was about what he now understood. The door of the patrol car remained open for a few seconds longer before he gently pulled. It closed, the sound soft, controlled, nothing like the sharp finality of earlier moments. And as the door clicked shut, it felt less like an ending and more like a transition, something shifting from one state to another, from assumption to awareness, from certainty to reflection. He reached for the radio then, but paused before pressing the button, the hesitation not from doubt, but from intention, choosing the words before speaking them. Unit 12, he began, his voice steady but different. Now, quieter in a way that carried more weight. Situation resolved. He stopped there, not adding more, not explaining, because some things could not be summarized in a report. Some things existed beyond language. And as he released the button, the silence that followed felt earned, not empty. Outside, the streetlights continued to glow, unchanged, casting their steady light over a scene that looked exactly as it had before, but for Hayes, the difference was permanent, because the next time he stepped out of this car, the next time he saw someone standing where Amara had stood, the moment would not begin the same way. It could not after this, because once you see the cost of deciding too quickly, you do not forget it, you carry it, and sometimes, that is where real change begins, not in the moment of action, but in the quiet seconds after, when everything becomes clear. The patrol car rolled forward slowly, merging back into the quiet flow of the street. But inside, nothing moved at the same pace anymore, because Officer Hayes was no longer responding on instinct. He was thinking, and thinking had a way of slowing everything down, stretching each second just enough to examine it, to question it, to understand it before acting. And as he drove, the city lights passed by in steady rhythm, storefronts closing, traffic thinning, the ordinary patterns of a night that had no idea it had just revealed something important. And yet he carried that moment with him, not as a burden, but as something sharper, something that refused to be ignored. At the next intersection he stopped, the red light casting a glow across the dashboard, and for a second he simply watched it. The stillness, the pause, the forced moment of waiting. And it reminded him of what had been missing earlier, that pause, that hesitation before deciding, the space where a question could have replaced an assumption. And it became clear to him now that the absence of that pause had shaped everything, not the situation itself, but the way he had entered it, the way he had already decided what it was before it had the chance to reveal itself. The light turned green, but he did not accelerate. Immediately, his foot hovering just slightly before pressing down, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, choosing the action instead of reacting to it. And as the car moved forward again, the radio remained silent. No calls, no updates, just the low hum of the engine and the quiet rhythm of the road, giving him space to think without interruption, because sometimes silence is not empty. Sometimes it is where understanding begins to take shape. He thought about the way she had stood there, calm, steady, not trying to prove anything, not trying to fight back, just present in a way that made everything else feel louder. And it struck him that her silence had not been weakness. It had been control. The kind of control that does not need to assert itself because it already exists, and that realization stayed with him as he turned onto another street. The buildings now more spaced out, the traffic lighter, the night deeper. And for the first time since the encounter, he allowed himself to acknowledge something fully, not partially, not defensively, but clearly, that the moment had never been about what she did or did not do. It had been about what he assumed before he knew anything at all. And that understanding did not come with excuses, it did not come with justification. It simply existed, plain and direct. And as he continued driving, one thought settled in more firmly than the rest, not as a question, but as a realization, that authority is not measured by how quickly you act, but by how carefully you choose to see before you do. The road stretched ahead in long, quiet lines, the kind that give a person too much time to think. And for Officer Hayes, that was exactly what this night had become, not a shift, not a routine patrol, but a turning point he could not ignore, because the more distance he put between himself and that moment, the clearer it became, not fading like most incidents, but sharpening, every detail settling into place with uncomfortable precision. He passed a closed gas station, its lights dimmed, the empty parking lot reflecting the glow of his headlights. And something about that emptiness mirrored the space in his mind, a space where certainty used to sit without question, now replaced by something else, something more deliberate, more cautious. He slowed as he approached another intersection. Even though the road was clear, no cars, no pedestrians, nothing forcing him to stop, and yet he did, easing his foot onto the brake, allowing the car to come to a full pause, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And that choice felt different, small, almost insignificant, but meaningful in a way he had not noticed before, because earlier that night, he had not chosen to pause. He had moved forward without it, and now he understood what that had cost. The quiet hum of the engine filled the car, steady and constant, grounding him in the present, while his thoughts moved between what had happened and what it meant, not just for that moment, but for every moment like it, every encounter shaped by the same instinct to decide before understanding. And he realized something then, something that did not come as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual clarity, that this was not about one mistake, it was about a pattern, a way of seeing that had gone unquestioned for too long. And patterns do not change with a single realization. They change with awareness, repeated, reinforced, chosen again and again. He looked at his reflection briefly in the rearview mirror, the faint outline of his own face staring back at him, and for a second, it felt unfamiliar, not physically, but in what it now represented, not just authority, not just experience, but responsibility in a deeper sense. Responsibility for how he chose to see people before he chose to act. The light at the intersection turned green, but again, he did not move. Immediately, giving himself that extra second, that extra breath, the pause that had been missing before, and then he drove forward, not faster, not slower, but with intention, the city opening up ahead of him, familiar streets now carrying a different meaning, because this time, he was not just moving through them. He was aware of how he moved, and that awareness stayed with him, steady, persistent, shaping the way he looked at everything, the way he listened, the way he would respond the next time, because there would be a next time. There always is. And when that moment comes, the difference will not be in the situation itself. It will be in the space before it, the pause, the question, the decision to understand before deciding. And as the patrol car disappeared deeper into the night, one truth remained, quiet but undeniable. Real authority is not proven in the moment of control. It is proven in the moment you choose to question yourself before control is ever needed. The night had settled into a deeper quiet now, the kind that comes after the city exhales its last rush of movement, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of distant traffic and the low hum of streetlights. And as Officer Hayes continued his patrol, something in the way he saw the world had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone passing by would notice, but internally, fundamentally. The difference was undeniable, because every face he passed, every figure walking along the sidewalk, every car waiting at an intersection no longer appeared as quick conclusions to be made, but as moments to be understood, and that shift, subtle as it was, carried more weight than any instruction he had ever been given. He turned down a quieter street, lined with small houses, porch lights glowing softly, shadows stretching across the pavement, and for a moment, the scene felt almost still, like time had slowed just enough to allow him to observe without pressure, without urgency. And that was when he noticed her, an elderly woman standing near the edge of her driveway, holding a small bag, looking uncertain as she glanced toward the road, and instinctively, the old pattern flickered for a second, the quick assessment, the silent categorizing. But this time it did not take hold. This time there was a pause, deliberate, conscious, and in that pause came a different approach, one that did not begin with assumption, but with attention. He slowed the patrol car, not abruptly, not with flashing lights, just a gentle deceleration, pulling slightly to the side, lowering the window as he spoke, his voice calm, measured. "Ma'am, do you need any assistance?" And the question, simple as it was, carried something different within it. Not authority, not suspicion, but presence. The woman turned, surprised at first, then relieved, explaining she had been waiting for a ride that was running late, her tone soft, her posture easing as she spoke. And Hayes listened, not interrupting, not directing, just listening, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing it into something it was not. And as the conversation continued, brief but genuine, he realized something important, that understanding does not come from control. It comes from patience, from allowing people to exist as they are before deciding who they might be. After a few minutes, the woman thanked him, her ride arriving shortly after, headlights pulling into the driveway. And as Hayes nodded and drove away, the moment stayed with him, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was different. It was what could have happened earlier, what should have happened. And that contrast, quiet but clear, reinforced everything he had begun to understand. The road ahead stretched out again, familiar and unchanged, but his perspective no longer matched the patterns he once followed, because once awareness takes hold, it does not fade. It reshapes, it redirects, it stays. And as he continued through the quiet streets, one truth settled deeper than the rest, not spoken, not announced, but understood, that the difference between authority and judgment is not the badge. It is the moment you choose to see before you decide. The night continued to unfold in quiet layers, each passing minute carrying less urgency and more clarity. And as Officer Hayes moved through the city, the streets no longer felt like places to control, but spaces to understand. Every turn, every stop, every passing figure now filtered through a different lens, one shaped not by assumption, but by awareness. And it was not something he had to force. It had settled into him naturally, like a shift that had been waiting to happen. He slowed again. As he approached a dimly lit intersection, no traffic, no movement, just the soft glow of a single streetlight casting long shadows across the asphalt. And for a moment he stopped completely, not because the law required it, but because something inside him did, a quiet instinct to pause, to take in the moment before moving through it. And in that stillness, he thought about how easily moments can be misunderstood when they are rushed, how quickly people can be defined by appearances when there is no space to question what is seen. And that thought stayed with him as he looked out across the empty road, realizing that what had happened earlier was not just about one person or one decision. It was about the absence of that pause, the absence of curiosity, the absence of the simple act of asking before deciding. And now, that absence had been replaced with something else, something more deliberate, more human, more aware. The radio remained quiet, no calls breaking the silence, no urgency pulling him forward, just the steady presence of the moment itself. And for the first time that night, that silence did not feel like a gap to be filled. It felt like something meaningful, something necessary, because it was in that silence that understanding had taken shape, not through instruction, not through correction, but through experience, through contrast, through seeing the difference between acting quickly and seeing clearly. He finally pressed lightly on the accelerator, the patrol car moving forward once more, but this time with intention behind every motion, every turn chosen, every glance measured, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. And as the city stretched out ahead of him, familiar yet subtly changed, one realization remained steady, guiding everything that came next, that the true measure of authority is not found in the power to act, but in the discipline to pause, to question, and to understand before that power is ever used. And in that understanding, something else emerged, something quieter but far more lasting. Respect, not demanded, not enforced, but earned through the simple act of seeing people for who they are before deciding who they must be. The city eventually gave way to the quiet edge of dawn, where the sky softened from black to a muted gray, and the streets, once filled with motion and noise, settled into a calm that felt almost reflective. And as Officer Hayes guided his patrol car through the final stretch of his shift, there was no urgency left in his movements, no need to prove control, only a steady awareness that followed him like a quiet companion, the kind that does not fade with time but deepens with it. He slowed near a familiar overlook where the city skyline stretched out in the distance, lights still flickering against the early morning haze. And for a moment he pulled over, not because he had to, but because he chose to, stepping out of the car into the cool air, the silence around him no longer empty, but full of everything the night had revealed. He rested his hands lightly on the roof of the car, looking out across the horizon. And for the first time, he did not see the city as something to manage or control, but as something to move through carefully, thoughtfully, because every street, every person, every moment carried more than what appeared on the surface. And that understanding had not come from training, not from instruction, but from a single moment that refused to be ignored, a moment where assumption met reality and lost, not through force, but through truth. And as he stood there, the memory of her presence remained clear, not the uniform, not the title, but the way she had stood without fear, without urgency, grounded in something that could not be taken away by misunderstanding. And it became clear to him that real strength does not need to announce itself. It does not need to prove anything. It simply exists, steady and unshaken, waiting for others to recognize it, or fail to. And in that realization, something shifted permanently, not in the way he wore the badge, but in the way he carried it. Because a badge does not define authority, it reflects it, and what it reflects depends entirely on the person behind it. He took a slow breath, the cool air filling his lungs, grounding him in the present, in the clarity that had taken shape through the night. And when he finally stepped back into the patrol car, there was no sense of ending, only continuation. Because this was not the kind of lesson that stays in one moment. It moves forward, shaping every decision that follows. And as the engine started and the city began to wake, one thought remained, quiet but unshakable, echoing through everything he had come to understand. That night, he thought he was enforcing the law, but the truth was, the law was teaching him, and it did not raise its voice. It did not demand attention. It simply revealed itself. In the moment, he almost chose not to see it.